And later,
Really, she vanished into thin air.
the day the music died.
He could be violent, and he could be charming, he could be loving, and he could be controlling.
You're not going anywhere.
I'm Christopher Mason. Being born into a large family fortune should be a great blessing, but the silver spoon is often dipped in poison. Greed can turn a glorious birthright into a noose around your neck. Behind mansion walls, these pedigreed offspring are cursed with a toxic inheritance.
Up next, behind mansion walls, the wealthy gent,
There was a lot of money involved.
the younger wife,
He loved her, but he loved her in a very controlling sense.
and the riddle of the unfinished symphony.
This woman had gone missing in broad daylight.
The bigger a city is, the easier it can be for someone to disappear into it. Home to 10 million people, London, England has no shortage of places to hide. For the living, or for the dead.
Really, she vanished into thin air. Nobody had any idea where she'd gone.
This is the last footage ever captured of 40-year-old Gracia Morton. In the lobby of her luxury apartment building, she checks her reflection in the mirror and steps out into the unknown.
Even if you disappear in the middle of a very busy city like London, in some cases it's just impossible to find out what's happened to you.
In the back seats of their Bentleys and in their oak-paneled drawing rooms, Gracia's neighbors express their horror. If the streets of the royal borough of Chelsea and Kensington aren't safe, then nowhere is.
It's known as the Royal Borough for good reason. Since the 17th century, kings and queens of England have called it home. Just a quarter mile from Gracia's apartment is Kensington Palace, once home to the late Princess Diana. Of course, the People's Princess wasn't the first royal bride to suffer a tragic death. Henry VIII famously dealt with his marital discontent by beheading two of his wives.
Just like the king's ill-fated spouses, Gracia Morton had married into money. And police wonder whether this fact is somehow connected to her disappearance.
She was from Argentina originally, and she was a trained classical violinist. And she came over here to improve her skills and, perhaps make a career of it over here. But then she met Michael Morton through her sister. He was 20 years older than her, and they fell in love and got married, and then had a child.
Debonair English gentleman Michael Morton might be a little old, but age comes with certain benefits.
Michael Morton had a lot of private money he'd invested wisely over the years. Michael Morton could have been considered to be a very wealthy man. Gracia was very attractive, intelligent, classical musician, elegant, and I think liked the idea of being in love. And she was doubtless bowled over by this older man.
When Michael's mother dies, his fortune increases. He inherits more than £1 million and bestows a gift on his wife, £500,000 in her own bank account.
Like it? Yes. You're wearing a beautiful pink dress tonight.
There was a lot of money involved. She had money that he'd given her in a special account.
Then, in early 1997, Gracia files for divorce. She moves into an elegant new apartment and into the arms of a new love.
She bought a large flat. She bought a car. She also spent money on decorating the flat.
It's that very apartment that Gracia's boyfriend says he enters on the morning of November 13th, 1997.
Gracia, darling. Darling, are you here? Gracia, where are you? Gracia?
There was no sign of Gracia. The cat was unfed. Gracia's clothing was still there. We got to go to the police.
Well, the police obviously had a fairly open mind about the case. All they knew was that this woman had gone missing in broad daylight, no signs of a violent struggle or anything. So they had to consider all eventualities.
And in a city the size of London, there's no shortage of those.
Could have been a random stranger attack. And no doubt there were inquiries about whether there had been any attacks on women in that area of West London. There was a case not long before, about a year before, where a French student had been hitchhiking. She'd been abducted by a lorry driver and murdered.
Gracia might have met with foul play. She might have also disappeared by choice, but she hasn't gone without a trace.
She left her car, her keys, her mobile phone. Does anybody know what's happened to her?
In the shadow of grand old English mansions on a stylish London street, police discover an abandoned car. It belongs to beautiful Argentinian violinist Gracia Morton. She's been missing for 2 days.
It was a fairly ordinary day in November 1997 when Gracia took her daughter to school and everything was quite normal. She didn't say anything particularly special to the child. She just simply dropped her off at school and really she vanished into thin air.
Police find her cell phone and other belongings. But just as intriguing as what's in the car is where it was discovered.
It was obviously rather strange that she left her car outside his home.
The $1 million home of her estranged husband, Michael Morton.
And he was, by his own account, the last person to see her alive.
Morton admits he argued with his estranged wife on the day she disappeared.
I'm not really happy about it.
He said there had been a row between them about their daughter's schooling. He denies that there was any violence.
No, I am not happy about
And I'm listening, but it's my decision, and that is where she's
He claims she left, bizarrely leaving her car and her car keys with him.
outside, and I have some things I have to do, so I need you to look after it. Okay?
And then she was never seen again. Police sift through every nook and cranny of Morton's London home and stumble upon a heartwarming scene. Gracia's devoted husband has set up a shrine to his missing wife.
And they were basically photo frames with some flowers or candles nearby. But what was strange about them is how quickly they appeared after the Gracia disappeared. Whereas she was essentially missing, she could have gone off with her boyfriend or with another man or something. Who knows what had happened to her. But he almost immediately jumps to the conclusion that she's dead.
While Morton seems able to peer into the future, police are looking into his past. They hear he often referred to his wife as a surgically enhanced trophy. And there are rumors he imposed some bizarre conditions on their relationship, warning Gracia, if she displayed any signs of premenstrual moodiness, he would consider himself unmarried.
He was very controlling.
It's time for you to give Celeste her bath.
And when Gracia sort of showed a bit of independence, a bit of unwillingness to go along, she, then eventually wanted to leave him, he was absolutely furious.
Michael can't stand playing second fiddle to another man. He's enraged when Gracia leaves him.
He told a friend, women just can't do that to me. He would happily drop women himself, but he didn't like women to decide a relationship was over.
He could be violent, and he could be charming, he could be loving, and he could be controlling. He was ultimately a very complicated man.
Complicated. And now that he's been abandoned by his wife, increasingly angry.
He had sent a fax to the family's home in Birmingham, where Gracia had gone to get away from him.
His message claims that marriage is indissoluble and forever.
I will not go through the amount of pain. This is not a threat, it's just common sense. Obviously, in hindsight, it was a veiled threat that he was making, that he wouldn't accept being rejected by her.
Police hear that Gracia feels so threatened by Michael Morton, she refuses to tell him her new address. Which begs the question, has she returned to Argentina, changing her name and identity to escape him?
Her British passport was still there, all her clothes were still there, so she had no means, she had no clothing, she had no baggage, suitcases.
And she'd also left behind her beloved daughter.
Gracia loved her completely, and this was the central theme of the case. Would Gracia get up and leave her life behind? And above all, the daughter who was the most important thing in the world to her.
Then, on Morton's computer, police discover a chilling indication of his state of mind.
This was one of many documents which he had written entirely for his own purposes. It was a story of a man who had killed his wife and children through jealousy and rage.
Morton's article is based on a real-life murder case. Prosecutors believe it might be a veiled confession.
And what Morton was doing in this document was to write an intellectual analysis of the case in the sense of understanding why the killer killed his family.
But sympathizing with a killer doesn't make Morton guilty of murder. For 6 years, British police search for Gracia. They find no sign of her. And there's not enough evidence to charge her husband.
He came across as a very cold character. Didn't really show any emotion at all. Didn't seem to be upset by her disappearance.
You must have some idea.
None whatsoever.
But Gracia's family wants answers.
Where would she have gone?
They put pressure on
You
police.
must have said something.
No.
And in 2003, Scotland Yard reopens the case. Fresh witnesses come forward. A neighbor describes Morton acting like a zombie outside his home on the very day Gracia disappeared.
Various witnesses saw him carrying a large piece of vegetation and sort of staggering along under the weight of it. Clearly, in hindsight, that could have been her body wrapped up.
Another neighbor sees Morton doing a spot of spring cleaning.
Morton was seen with, I think, a dustpan and brush sweeping out the back of his car on one occasion, but that was the only piece of evidence which may have suggested disposal by him of the body, which clearly he had to do.
But the evidence is all circumstantial.
There wasn't enough evidence. There wasn't any forensic evidence to tie him to her murder. And with no body, it was quite hard for them to categorically prove that he'd killed her.
Then, Big Brother provides a revelation that will change everything.
The police went through reams and reams of hours of CCTV footage from outside her flat.
Caught on video, a mysterious man entering Gracia's building. Could this be the break police have been waiting for?
A classic case of good, old-fashioned police work.
I think that CCTV footage was the clincher.
In London, England, British police sift through hours of security footage from the flat of missing millionairess Gracia Morton. Finally, a detective hits pay dirt.
And he's suddenly come across this footage of Michael Morton letting himself into her flat with her keys the day after she's gone missing.
Seems innocent enough. Michael Morton is, after all, Gracia's husband. But for a woman once bowled over by Morton, Gracia has learned to stand up for herself. And that includes holding on to a few secrets.
She was absolutely paranoid about him finding out where she lived, and she scrupulously told everybody, do not tell him my address.
That was the major turning point which led back to Michael Morton. He had always claimed to the police that he didn't know where she lived, but clearly he did.
What he did there, we can't really be sure, but it's the fact that he never told the police or never told anyone about that visit, and it's very suspicious.
Gracia's boyfriend supplies more evidence. This isn't the only time since her disappearance that Morton has secretly entered the apartment.
He arrived, to his horror, to find Gracia's man friend inside the flat.
Gracia, darling, is that you? What are you doing here?
And he had suddenly to make some pretty quick excuses as to what he was doing there.
What are you doing here? Where's Gracia? I don't know. I don't know. I gotta go. I don't think she'd appreciate you being here. I gotta go.
When police confront Morton with his lies, he refuses to explain himself. In October 2003, Scotland Yard finally thinks they have enough evidence to charge him with murder. They build a picture of what they believe happened to Gracia that day.
She obviously went to his house quite willingly.
I'm not really happy about it.
Didn't bring anyone with her.
Michael, I don't
There must have been a blazing row.
Almost certainly it was this resentment and anger that she was leaving him and taking his money. That's what boiled over.
Michael, let go of me! Michael!
It may have been a spur-of-the-moment thing. It may have been a crime of passion, just a row that got out of hand, and he struck her or strangled her or whatever. Or he may have planned it. He may have lured her to his house and decided, right, I'm going to get rid of this woman. You know, she's costing me too much money. She's rejected me. I hate her. I'm going to kill her. Without her body, we'll never know exactly how she died.
Michael Morton stands trial for murder at London's Old Bailey in October 2004. He declines to take the stand.
During the trial, he claimed throughout that he was innocent. It came across as quite cagey, like he was playing a very cunning game. He was basically saying to them, you prove it.
And that game works. The jury fails to reach a verdict. For high-profile Crown prosecutor Brian Altman, cases don't get much tougher than this.
It was disappointing, but inevitably you have a think about whether there's anything you can change, if you can freshen up the case. And I think we did find a couple of avenues and slightly different ways of approach.
In 2005, a retrial begins. New evidence emerges that will shed light on the real Michael Morton.
There was evidence that he had been violent towards her in the past. He'd laughed it off even after her disappearance.
Where do you think you're going?
He had been tape recorded by one of the sisters sometime later, admitting that he had struck Gracia in the course of their relationship.
He'd had hit Gracia several times, including when she was pregnant. So he did have quite a temper on him.
This time, it is enough to convince the jury. Almost 8 years since Gracia's disappearance, her millionaire husband is acquitted of her murder, but found guilty of manslaughter.
Which is basically a killing which doesn't involve any intent. So that could be killing somebody during a row or a momentary loss of control.
The jury did not convict him of murder. The reason for that, I am convinced, is because the body was never found.
The judge sentenced him to 7 years, but he wouldn't have served the full 7 years.
Now freed, Morton denies Gracia's family the chance to grieve at her grave.
They have been devastated. Devastated that Morton hasn't had the decency and the courage to tell them where Gracia, the woman after all he once loved so deeply that he couldn't let her go, where he has buried her body.
Gracia and Michael's daughter is now 19. Her life scarred forever by the day her mom didn't come home.
If I was her, I would say to him, you know, tell me what you did with my mother, and, you know, maybe I'll see you, but I don't ever want to see you unless you are going to, you know, give me a sense of peace.
Where Gracia's remains are, we will never know.
Inheriting family money. It's wealth without the hard work. A legacy often taken for granted. For Anne Scripps Douglas, a proud heritage lured a deadly lover. While Michael Morton couldn't bear to share his gilded birthright. The good fortune of birth was tainted by murder, courtesy of a toxic inheritance. Till next we meet, behind mansion walls, I'm Christopher Mason.